It was a typical morning in Los Angeles, California. Streets buzzed with commuters, film crews prepared for shoots, and the hum of post-production studios filled the air. For decades, this was the rhythm of life around Warner Brothers, one of the cornerstones of Hollywood filmmaking. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Actors rehearsed, editors adjusted frames, and the scent of creativity lingered in every studio lot. Families counted on the steady paycheck of nearly 20,000 post-production jobs. Local restaurants served crew members daily, and entire neighborhoods thrived around the predictable cadence of movie magic. People assumed that this world would continue, uninterrupted, for decades to come. Then, without warning, everything shifted. Warner Brothers announced a gradual migration of its production and post-production operations to Georgia film hubs, lured by up to 30% tax credits. There was no time to prepare, no transitional notice, just a sudden pivot that would reshape livelihoods and the cultural heartbeat of Hollywood itself. The streets that once echoed with cameras and footsteps now felt quieter. Editors who had spent years shaping cinematic worlds wondered what their future would hold. Local businesses that had flourished around studio activity began to feel the tremors of change. If the heart of Hollywood could relocate overnight, leaving California behind, what does that mean for the future of American cinema? And more importantly, what happens to the communities and families who built their lives around a studio that no longer films in Hollywood? For more than a century, Warner Brothers stood as a pillar of the American film industry. Its sprawling studio lot in Los Angeles, California, covered acres of sound stages, editing rooms, and office spaces, housing a workforce that numbered in the tens of thousands. It wasn't just a place to make movies, it was a symbol of Hollywood itself, where generations of filmmakers, actors, and technicians contributed to the cultural fabric of the nation. The scale of operations was staggering. From production offices to post-production suites, Warner Brothers employed nearly 20,000 people in editing, visual effects, sound mixing, and administrative roles. Entire neighborhoods, from Burbank to nearby residential districts, grew around the stability and predictability provided by the studio's presence. Restaurants, coffee shops, and equipment rental companies thrived thanks to the daily rhythm of filmmakers and crew. For decades, the studio's influence stretched beyond California. Its films reached all corners of the United States, contributing not only to culture, but to the economy of multiple states through distribution and licensing. Local schools benefited from stable tax revenue, and families moved to the area confident that employment with Warner Brothers meant long-term stability. The belief was universal. A company of this magnitude and history could never simply disappear. Even as the film industry evolved, Warner Brothers appeared untouchable. New sound stages were added, technology was upgraded, and investments were made to keep the studio competitive. From early morning shoots to late-night editing sessions, the heartbeat of Hollywood pulsed steadily within those walls. Communities believed in the predictability the studio provided. Life revolved around production schedules, premieres, and studio events. Many assumed that as long as Hollywood existed, Warner Brothers would continue to define it, anchoring not just the film industry, but the lives of thousands who depended on its operations. Yet, beneath this sense of permanence, a quiet shift was taking shape, a decision that would eventually see the studio relocating significant operations to Georgia film hubs. The foundation that seemed unshakable was beginning to move, and what was once taken for granted would soon be tested like never before. The city of Burbank, California, and the surrounding neighborhoods were more than just locations. They were communities shaped entirely by the presence of Warner Brothers. Families settled here for the long term, confident that employment at the studio meant stability for generations. Local schools received consistent funding, thanks in part to tax revenue generated by the company, and after-school programs thrived as parents enjoyed reliable work schedules. Every corner of the community felt the studio's influence. Restaurants served breakfast to early morning crews, coffee shops buzzed with editors and animators during long hours, and local service providers, from transportation to equipment rental, depended on the daily rhythm of production. Even small businesses, from grocery stores to gyms, grew around the predictable flow of nearly 20,000 post-production jobs. The culture of stability was palpable. Residents knew that a steady paycheck from Warner Brothers meant mortgages were manageable, healthcare was accessible, and the future seemed predictable. Neighborhoods thrived not because of random chance, but because a single employer anchored the local economy and social fabric. Community events often revolved around the studio. Premiere nights, charity functions, and film festivals became traditions that strengthened ties between employees, families, and the city itself. Generations were born and raised with the sense that Warner Brothers was not just a studio, it was the heartbeat of the community. Even public services felt the impact. Fire and police departments, city planning, and public transportation adapted schedules and infrastructure to support the studio's operations. The very layout of streets, parking, and commuting patterns had been influenced by decades of film production activity. The city had grown around Warner Brothers, and the lives of thousands of families were intertwined with the studio's success. The stability was so deeply ingrained that few questioned what life would be like if the company were ever to relocate. But as whispers of the shift to Georgia film hubs began circulating, the community that had been built over decades started to sense the fragility beneath their seemingly unshakable foundation. For Mary, a visual effects editor who had spent 15 years at Warner Brothers, the news of the studio's relocation to Georgia film hubs hit hard. Her family had bought a home in Burbank, California, confident that her steady employment would cover the mortgage, healthcare, and the children's schooling for years to come. Overnight, that sense of predictability began to unravel. Across town, Carlos, a sound mixer nearing retirement, faced a similar dilemma. He had dedicated over 30 years to Warner Brothers, building a life around the studio's consistent schedule. Relocating was not feasible. Moving to Georgia meant uprooting a family, finding new schools for teenagers, and navigating unfamiliar healthcare systems. The choice was stark: leave everything familiar or risk unemployment in a highly specialized field. Local businesses felt the tremors too. Coffee shops, restaurants, and equipment rental houses that had thrived on daily studio traffic saw revenues drop almost immediately. Families that had relied on the stability provided by nearly 20,000 post-production jobs began to cut back, creating a ripple effect throughout the community. Schools, reliant on property taxes and local funding, braced for potential shortfalls. The emotional cost was profound. Employees weren't just losing paychecks, they were losing stability. The routines, the relationships, and the structure that had defined decades of life in Burbank were suddenly uncertain. Parents worried about healthcare coverage, long-term planning for college tuition, and whether their neighborhoods would maintain the same quality of life. Even those who could theoretically relocate faced logistical challenges. Housing markets in Georgia film hubs were competitive, rental prices high, and the move itself disruptive. Many families realized that their ties to Warner Brothers had been more than just professional. They were social, cultural, and deeply personal. This was the human face of the studio's decision. Careers interrupted, futures recalculated, and a community forced to confront the fragility beneath decades of apparent predictability. If one of Hollywood's giants could relocate overnight, the question loomed large. What does stability truly mean when entire lives are built around a single employer? For years, the community had witnessed signs of Warner Brothers' strength and stability. New sound stages were constructed, technological upgrades were implemented, and multi-million-dollar investments reinforced the studio's commitment to Los Angeles, California. Employees and local families took comfort in these gestures, believing they were witnessing a company dedicated to its long-term presence. Contracts were extended, salary commitments maintained, and even expansion plans suggested that the studio's footprint would continue to grow. Local leaders and city officials celebrated Warner Brothers' influence, reinforcing a sense of security. Residents could see decades of history, financial investment, and community support as a guarantee that nothing could shake the foundation they had built their lives upon. Then, almost without warning, the narrative shifted. The announcement of the relocation to Georgia film hubs, motivated by up to 30% tax credits, revealed that the stability everyone relied upon had been more fragile than imagined. Families like Mary's and Carlos's felt the sudden shock of a company they trusted, silently choosing another state, leaving communities in California grappling with uncertainty. There had been no public warning, no phased plan, and no time to adjust. The sense of trust built over decades was suddenly disrupted. What had felt permanent decades of employment, community ties, and predictable schedules was revealed to be contingent, dependent on corporate strategy rather than loyalty to a city or workforce. This was the betrayal moment. the realization that even giants like Warner Brothers, with their immense financial investments and historical roots, could silently reshape the futures of thousands. For employees and the community alike, it was not merely a relocation, it was a profound redefinition of what commitment and security truly meant. The decision by Warner Brothers to relocate significant operations to Georgia Film Hubs was not sudden, even if it appeared so to employees and the local community. Multiple factors converged over years, creating a situation where maintaining the status quo in California became increasingly untenable. Costs were rising steadily. Utilities, energy, and property expenses in Los Angeles, California, had climbed to levels that strained margins. Maintaining sprawling studio lots, operating advanced post-production suites, and supporting thousands of employees became increasingly expensive. These escalating costs created pressure on the studio's bottom line, prompting executives to explore alternatives that could preserve profitability while sustaining operations. Logistics also played a role. Moving large-scale production to Georgia offered streamlined access to new filming locations, sound stages, and post-production facilities. It reduced certain transportation burdens and facilitated more flexible scheduling for multiple projects simultaneously. The logistics of distributing equipment, managing crews, and coordinating shoots across multiple sites had become increasingly complex in California, where congestion and infrastructure limits posed challenges to efficiency. Labor considerations contributed as well. While nearly 20,000 post-production jobs remained a cornerstone of the local economy, the labor market in California had become highly competitive, with wages rising to attract and retain specialized talent. This, combined with the rising cost of living, created a financial burden that directly impacted the studio's margins. Consumer behavior and industry trends influenced the decision too. Streaming platforms, rapid content turnover, and global distribution demands required studios to adapt quickly. Warner Brothers had to remain competitive in a market where audience expectations for speed, quality, and variety were evolving faster than traditional Hollywood infrastructure could reliably support. Incentives offered by Georgia Film Hubs, including up to 30% tax credits, were another significant factor. They provided a concrete financial advantage that made relocation economically compelling, allowing the studio to reallocate resources into production quality, technology, and new projects. These consumer behavior shifts and cost pressures combined to create a scenario where maintaining all operations in California was no longer the most sustainable strategy. It is crucial to note that no single factor dictated this move. Rising costs, logistical challenges, labor dynamics, industry trends, and state incentives collectively shaped the decision. Supply chain considerations for equipment, post-production workflows, and content delivery also reinforced the appeal of a more centralized, cost-effective location. By analyzing these layers, it becomes clear that the relocation was a strategic response to complex pressures rather than a simple abandonment of Hollywood or disregard for the local workforce. Ultimately, the real reasons behind Warner Brothers' shift were rooted in operational pragmatism and industry evolution. The company sought to protect its competitive edge while navigating the realities of costs, logistics, supply chain, margins, and consumer behavior. Understanding these factors allows for a nuanced view of the situation. The impact on communities was profound, but the decision itself was driven by broader structural dynamics in the film industry. The relocation of Warner Brothers to Georgia Film Hubs did more than shift jobs across state lines. It sent ripples throughout the entire American film industry. Equipment suppliers, post-production houses, and freelance technicians who relied on the steady flow of projects in California suddenly faced gaps in demand, impacting both income and project timelines. Prices for certain services began to fluctuate. As more production moved to Georgia, local vendors in Los Angeles experienced reduced orders, while costs in Georgia rose slightly due to increased competition for studio space and skilled labor. The subtle changes in prices of equipment rentals, editing services, and production support soon reached studios and, ultimately, the consumers who rely on the steady release of movies and television content. Delays became a concern. Projects that had historically relied on the California ecosystem, including specialized post-production workflows, had to adapt to new locations, technologies, and teams. Even minor disruptions in editing or visual effects could add days or weeks to production schedules, affecting release dates for films and streaming content. These delays, while invisible to many, meant that audiences sometimes waited longer for the entertainment they expected. The broader supply chain felt the impact as well. From the transport of cameras, props, and digital assets to the coordination of crews across states, the shift introduced new layers of complexity. Studios had to reconfigure their logistics to accommodate the geographic relocation, while freelance talent had to navigate contracts and travel logistics they had not previously considered. Everyday life, though indirectly, was affected too. The California neighborhoods built around nearly 20,000 post-production jobs saw fewer local events tied to the studio, less patronage for restaurants and shops, and a quieter streetscape. Communities that had thrived alongside Warner Brothers experienced the subtle but undeniable impact of a major corporate relocation. This ripple effect illustrated that the departure of one Hollywood giant was not just an industry story. It touched prices, delays, consumers, and everyday life in ways that reminded Americans how closely their entertainment economy was tied to a single corporate hub. The story of Warner Brothers leaving California is part of a larger pattern across the country. Other studios, production companies, and creative hubs have quietly relocated operations to states offering financial incentives, lower costs, and more favorable working conditions. For example, a major animation studio once anchored in New York City moved significant segments of its post-production to North Carolina, drawn by tax breaks and lower operational expenses. Similarly, a visual effects house in Chicago shifted its main operations to Louisiana, citing infrastructure support and access to specialized crews. In both cases, the communities left behind experienced reductions in employment, local revenue, and cultural engagement, mirroring the effects seen in Burbank. Even as these moves occur, the industry rarely publicizes the shifts, maintaining a sense of continuity to the public. Yet the reality is clear. Corporate relocation has become a recurring phenomenon, and Hollywood is no exception. Patterns of migration, tax-driven incentives, and labor optimization reveal that this is not isolated, but rather a systemic trend across the country. By recognizing these patterns, one can understand that the challenges faced by California communities, lost jobs, disrupted routines, and economic ripple effects are not unique. They are part of a broader national story in which businesses quietly reposition themselves for financial sustainability, leaving local ecosystems to adapt to sudden change. The streets of Burbank, California, once alive with the hum of cameras, footsteps, and production chatter, now feel quieter. Warner Brothers, a studio that had defined the rhythm of life for decades, has shifted its operations to Georgia film hubs, leaving behind empty parking lots, silent editing suites, and neighborhoods adjusting to a new reality. Local cafes, once filled with editors and crew, now serve fewer customers. Shops that depended on daily foot traffic noticed the absence, and streets that had thrived on the predictable patterns of studio life carry a subtle, lingering stillness. Families who built their lives around nearly 20,000 post-production jobs are left to contemplate the fragility of the world they trusted would remain constant. The city adapts, as it always has, but the echoes of departure remain. The investments, the history, the shared routines, all markers of a stable community, have been disrupted by a corporate decision made hundreds of miles away. No solutions are offered, no promises of return are made, and the silence underscores a fundamental truth. Stability is not guaranteed, even when it seems unshakable. As the sun sets over the quiet streets, a deeper reflection emerges. If one of Hollywood's giants can relocate nearly overnight, reshaping livelihoods, communities, and routines, it raises a question that lingers far beyond film studios and tax incentives. If something this foundational can disappear overnight, what does stability really mean anymore?